This is the Portland Police Bureau. This is a civil disturbance, and we have declared an unlawful assembly. Leave the area now, or you may be subject to force.
Welcome back to Revolution Radio. Just kidding. We're still just two white dudes sitting in their houses in quarantine who, in between their checking of the news and trying to get the world record on the pod racing section of the original Lego Star Wars, want to talk about politics. So here we are, back again to talk about politics. Nathan, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I threw out my neck in quarantine, which was unfun. So I'll be a little in pain this episode, which might explain slightly more aggressive ramblings as we go along.
Well, I think that in terms of aggressive ramblings are in order because today we want to talk about the ongoing protests, of course, the Supreme Court's rulings on the Civil Liberties Act in terms of trans rights. The autonomous zone has been set up in relation to the protests in both the main ones in Seattle and also in our home city of Portland, Oregon. We had one for a short bit. And also updates to the case and situation of Breonna Taylor, who we will talk about later. To begin, to talk about the autonomous zones. So if you don't know, it is a result from the protests in many locations, most predominantly in Seattle on the Capitol Hill district of Seattle. There was an autonomous zone set up, of which protesters went and cordoned off such sections of the street and occupied a police precinct building and declared it a no-cop zone. And they called it, it's either referred to as CHOP or Chaz. I personally prefer Chaz because it sounds cooler, as in Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And it's, until now, it's been going for about, I would say, a week now. And it has been a good example, I guess, an exemplification of what anarchy could look like in terms of, a system of governance, because anarchy gets a very, very bad rep as being just a synonym for, chaos, conflict, crime, and wrongdoing. But rather in terms of it being a political ideology, it really just means the abolishment of hierarchy, and especially hierarchy that is seen as unjust or oppressive, and the establishment of a society of more of a horizontal form of authority. So there's no one who is above each other. It's a society based on egalitarianism. However, recently, today as of recording, Saturday the 20th, there was a shooting in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, of which one protester was killed and another one was wounded, of which they're both rushed to the hospital by medics of the zone, and one of them sadly passed. Nathan, do you have anything to add about these autonomous zones?
Yeah, so for reference, the distinction between CHOP and Chaz is CHOP stands for occupancy protest. And the distinction there, I guess, is entirely legal. An autonomous zone would be, sort of seceding from the rest of the city, and in that way, I think would be illegal and not protected by the right to assembly, versus an occupancy protest, which is, again, framing it as a site of protest with some specific rules to keep it protected under the Constitution. In response to the protests, Councilwoman Sawant, who is a Seattle councilwoman who is a socialist and has sort of backed this movement, theorized that the violence was perpetrated by right-wing protesters. And some other comments that I've seen online, although the details are unclear, seem to show that as the police tried to enter, the victims of the shooting had already left, had already been taken towards the hospital by volunteers.
And to build off of what Nathan said about the exact incident of the shooting, from my point of view, I, of course, assume this is some type of right-wing militia that rolled up in their Ford F-150, fired a few rounds, and then drove off. My assumption was it was not perpetrated by protesters actually occupying the zone itself. Something else to mention was there's been conflicting reports on the situation of the medics that are involved in the zone about, because the wounded protesters were rushed to the hospital by the medics of the zone itself, and not, the EMTs of the city of Seattle, the doctors and the ambulances and whatnot. And there's been conflicting reports, and not too much substantial evidence about whether or not medical units of the city refused to respond to calls from the zone. But also that should be noted is the police officers that responded to the shooting and tried to enter the zone. You will see definitely there's going to be, I don't know if you've seen already, but at least terms of propaganda saying about how the officers couldn't enter because there was a violent crowd. But the cops did roll up in multiple squad cars carrying riot shields and their ARs. So once again, this is showing that the police are not really there to de-escalate, and they definitely weren't there to go and find the victims. And as Nathan said, the victims were already gone at that point. So they may have just been showing up there using the victims as an excuse to do something. I don't know.
Yeah. I think attempts to frame this as an example of how the CHOP or the Chaz is, chaos is very disingenuous, but it does raise serious questions about how this group of people will protect themselves going forward as this protest continues, especially when there are right-wing aggressors and there are people who want to do harm to those occupying this zone. So we'll keep you updated, and we'll stay updated on what continues to happen and the decisions that the organizers of the protest do make in response to this recent tragedy.
Yeah. Along with the autonomous zone in Seattle, we also had one for a short time in Portland, organized, I believe, late Wednesday night that lasted until early Wednesday morning. A autonomous zone was set up in downtown Portland on Gleason, I believe. I think it was called the Gleason Autonomous Zone or whatnot. Looked pretty cool. Lasted only a few hours. But while the autonomous zone in Portland wasn't the major thing of note, because we can give more in-depth reporting because this stuff happens within our own city, and because we are involved in all of this, was the continuing protests in Portland, Oregon, have been in response to the decision by our mayor, Ted Wheeler, to go forwards on a budget that did not reflect the wishes of the protest and the movement that's been going on. So the Black Lives Matter protests in our city have been demanding a moving forwards towards something proposed by the Eight Can't Wait campaign, but also more quickly on the docket, a complete defunding of police. So this would happen incrementally, and then they would move presumably towards reinvesting different things, and then maybe even towards abolition. But the first thing on the docket was a $50 million dollar defunding of the $50 million they have received in the past 4 years in terms of budget increases. However, City Council refused to do this and only cut it by $15 million. And the resorting protest, i.e. the autonomous zone, were set up to reflect all of this. And before we get to that, and we also had a statue pulled down in our city too, so we can talk about the statues and whatnot. I just want to talk about the idea that campaigns, Black Lives Matter, and all of these other things and ways we want to influence and change things in society exist inside of a window of change. People in the media and your officials and your governors and whatever other elected officials would like to say, oh, look, we have a budget deadline. You have to get in your wishes and your wants until now, and we will listen to it or not, or else that window of time and that window of change will pass. But there is no window of change. You either have the power to force change or you don't. The state, as a bureaucratic entity, likes to oppose arbitrary points like budget deadlines, to stop change, to slow it down, to be, sorry, you didn't make the cut this fiscal year, try again in maybe a decade or so. Those deadlines, in terms of, in Portland, those budget deadlines, that this was supposed to be for the next fiscal year and whatnot, are solely just constructs our officials have agreed to pretend exist to govern society, and they have no burden over change. So do not, while yes, in our own city, this $15 million reduction in police spending and budget is, of course, a great stepping stone and a great progress for the movement itself in terms of Black Lives Matter, fighting against police brutality. We have to understand that we don't have to play by the bureaucratic rules that society has imposed for change and protest to occur. With that said, we also had a George Washington statue that was taken down. That was pretty cool. Nathan, you want to talk about the statues? I know you're passionate about them.
Yeah, so with the recent takedown of a statue in Portland, there's been a lot of arguments over what the role of these statues is in honoring old figures who maybe created some positive change, but also were slave owners, for example. I think that we often make the argument that we shouldn't judge these figures by our modern moral standings and standards, but I think that's ridiculous. And I think what we really talk about when we talk about morality is what the majority kind of white privileged people think is okay, right? Stuff like slavery, it was no mystery that it was terrible. It was terrible for the people who were slaves, and the people who experienced from the outside that firsthand, visitors and people from other countries. It was no secret to them that these were horrible things, but it was accepted by the majority of Northerners and Southerners early on in American history. And so I think we should acknowledge that these were horrible things. I think in general, we shouldn't really be idolizing people. We really shouldn't be putting statues up because people are so complicated. And often many of the figures who have done great things in music, in history, activists, all of these people also have a dark side, And so I think we should focus on continuing to keep their name in the discourse over history and acknowledging that they exist and acknowledging their accomplishments, but not endorse people wholeheartedly and not endorse people fully as human beings, because you never know what the second narrative is that you're pushing, like that slavery in the 1700s was okay.
I honestly just think society has progressed past the need for statues. I just don't see the reason why there needs to be a giant thing of whatever Confederate general in my roundabout. I think it's cool if we did the thing of like what Virginia does and just has like statues of like a Mothman or whatever. That's cool. But I just don't see a purpose for statues too much anymore. It's just, yeah. I don't know. Nathan, did you know, I just learned this, I know this should be, like, common knowledge, and this is the failure of American education, but, like, did you know that, like, the Confederacy lasted for, like, 4 years? 4 years. Which is shorter than the... Pokemon Go has been going on for longer than the Confederacy has been going on for. And I went to high school for longer than the Confederacy was a thing. And I never talk about... And I am not proud of my heritage from high school. It's absurd. Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to share something I should have known already this week that I learned.
Yeah, and of course that's not even to acknowledge, and we could get all into it, the fact that like a lot of the statues for the Confederacy were erected post the Civil Rights Movement in response to that, but that's like a separate thing that we can't get into today.
And next, we want to move on to talking about Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor, if you don't remember, this incident happened a few months before George Floyd, but it's been another thing that has spurred the protests and someone else whose name sadly has to be chanted at these events. But if for those who don't know, the quick rundown is Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old African-American EMT who lived in Louisville, and one night the police executed a no-knock raid on her apartment. Upon entering, started shooting, and her boyfriend, Taylor's boyfriend, who rightfully thought their home was being invaded, return fire to the police. Taylor was killed in the gunfire by police, and her boyfriend was taken into custody. It should also be noted that the police had the wrong house by like a few miles. They were on the completely wrong side of town. So not only was this like an extrajudicial killing of just a completely innocent person, but also shows that while yes, police are racist pigs, they are completely and utterly incompetent. We bring this up because the story has unfortunately not gotten better, because one of the officers who was involved in the no-knock raid has been fired, not prosecuted or anything. So what this means is one of the members of, I don't know how many officers it takes to conduct a no-knock raid, but one of them has been fired out of presumably, I don't know, like 5 or something, and not prosecuted for their actions of just breaking into a completely innocent civilian's home and killing them for something they did not commit, or just killing them in general. It's yeah. If anything, this seems even more completely unjust and more emblematic of a completely tyrannical police state than the killing of George Floyd. That while yes, George Floyd exemplified like individual brutality that police are just able to commit, I feel that Breonna Taylor's death showed that while yes, the incompetence of the police state, but also just the extreme lengths they can go to just invade your home at the middle of the night, and when they are rightfully have to defend themselves, because the person at the home doesn't want to get shot and killed, that they can just prosecute that person and they can just walk free. That every single portion of the system and the bureaucratic mess that is the police state is made to work for them.
In other news, the Supreme Court ruled on the 15th in favor of protections for transgender and other LGBTQ workers under Title VII, which already extended those protections to people on the basis of sex and race. Now, what is interesting is the 6-3 ruling included Gorsuch, who has, regularly kind of been a more conservative judge, and also Roberts, who has shifted in recent years since he's become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from being somebody who voted against legalization of gay marriage in Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, and he's transitioned more into somebody who's trying to uphold the court and uphold precedent. So this is a really interesting case because I think it really marks the distinction between the political actions of the court and the law interpretation of the court. So, people always say that the Supreme Court is the non-political body, right? It acts outside of partisanship. Of course, it doesn't quite work out that way. Different interpretations of the Constitution, such as textualism, those align with the political interests of the presidents who appoint them. And so you end up kind of having partisan splits, and everyone acts with bias. But this was a really interesting case where people like Gorsuch saw that because of the protections on sex in the original Title VII, gender and sexual orientation were also included as protections. Because basically, take for example a gay man. They can't discriminate against a male. Again, it's sex and not gender, right? They can't discriminate against a male for having a relationship with another male, if they do not discriminate against a female for having a relationship with a male. So it's protected as an extension of not allowing those double standards. And so I think it's a really interesting look at where the court has gone. When Kavanaugh was appointed, people were really afraid, right, that it would spell the end of a lot of the precedent that has been set. Now, there is a big caveat to this, and that is that the implementation of this law, the new interpretation of this law actually has a lot of limits, because in a lot of states, bosses can fire their employees without giving a reason. So while these do protect from policies specifically aimed at trans people or other LGBTQ folk, it still allows individual targeting of those people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender, as long as the employer just doesn't disclose why they're firing their employee.
While I did not do too much reading into the case itself like you have, Nathan, my two reactions were reading the headlines and reading like a few little snippets of the entire case and whatnot. My two reactions to this was, I'd say a bad and more of a positive, that like the Supreme Court gets a bunch of praise here, even just doing the most basic things, not to be absolutely vile and tread across just the most basic of human rights to like exist in the workplace, as an entity that should be free from a discrimination and oppression just because of things they cannot change about themselves. But also the good side to it is that it shows that the right, well, yes, of course we can talk about like whether or not the court is supposed to be unbiased and apolitical or whatnot. Of course that's not always true because of the actors within the court, and they're not free from being apolitical, and especially for like somebody like Gorsuch voting for it, I think, to me at least, it shows that the right has understood that they are slowly losing the culture war with transgenderism. Because remember back when, like, okay, for example, with gay marriage and homosexuality, it is right now unthinkable, right, that measure would be overturned, that the Supreme Court would ever overturn that, and you don't see Republicans anymore and the right talking about, at least in the mainstream rather, about pushing back about homosexuality, and that's because they understood they lost the culture war. And after that, they immediately went in transition and pivoting to talk about transgenderism. And I think this is, while not, the final thing for that about them losing the war, I think this definitely shows that the right understands that they are losing now the culture war with transgenderism, and that the left is winning. And well, yes, small victory, and it's annoying that the Supreme Court can garner such praise from doing the bare minimum. That's a good thing.
I was just gonna say, you see that even with Kavanaugh, who voted against this Supreme Court decision, voted in the minority, he actually gave some good word to the LGBT workers in his dissenting statement, while also saying, "Oh, it's Congress's job, it's not ours." But even those people, even someone as far right as Kavanaugh, still has to maintain some, surface level support for the community. It's the same thing with Donald Trump, where while he rolls back things in secret, he seemed to be forward-facing, pro-LGBTQ Americans.
I do want to transition and talk about, because this is the funnier say, and talking more about like the political side about this. Did you see the GOP senator that blocked that the Equality Act in Senate by quoting J.K. Rowling? What was his name? James Lankford of Oklahoma.
He sounds like a Harry Potter
cited
character,
cited J.K. Rowling's recent blog post about that. Nathan, I don't know. Nathan, have you taken the time to read J.K. Rowling's great blog post about how she's totally not transphobic at all?
I've only caught a few sweet tweets from her. I'm not super familiar.
Okay, so I actually spent the time, and it was a complete waste of my time. I spent the time today reading all of it. It's like 20 paragraphs long, and it sucks, first off, but I also found it very funny, because about 18 of those 20 paragraphs were complete wastes of time, because, okay, so for the first, 18 paragraphs, she talks about how, I'm not transphobic, I completely agree with the struggles of trans folk in doing for this, and, looking... talking about women's rights and what's not. It was basic cookie cutter stuff. that could have been said by anybody and doesn't have to be said by her, or especially shouldn't be said by her. But then, after all of that, putting up all this work to talk about how she's not transphobic, she immediately just transitions to a paragraph of which she parrots the old GOP talking point about, well, what about a man walking into a women's bathroom, huh? Did you ever think about that one, liberals? And then immediately after, she talks about how silenced she's been, which I just have to say, God, you as the author with pretty much unlimited money and unlimited influence are being silenced by big trans or whatever. I wish it worked. But yeah, I don't know. I'll be honest. I hope I don't catch too much flack for this. I never read Harry Potter. It never really appealed to me. But I just don't understand how somebody like J.K. Rowling, somebody who's influenced in such a large part the growing up of like 3 generations now, who has, once again, basically unlimited power in terms of like social influence and cred as an author, and almost unlimited money, just uses her time just to get mad and owned by trans people on Twitter. It's quite sad, actually.
Man, maybe I'll have to take down my J.K. Rowling statue.
I did actually see something about like some boarding school in Britain, like named a house after her, like a barrack, not a barracks. I don't know what you call it, like a dorm, like a
British dorm, yeah.
Yeah. Had to unname it after her. So yeah, J.K. Rowling kind of sucks. It's honestly just sad. She could do so much else with her time, and this is just how she chooses to do it. Okay. To move off of J.K. Rowling and into the ending of this episode, we just kind of rambled around for a bunch of random things that happened and tried to connect them. But just want to tell you all to, stay safe out there, and if you're protesting, and if I want to offer some words to like validate the nature of the protests and how I've seen things that have been going, is that these protests and how that has been going forwards this is the best way for us to force power to change the systems that be in terms of police brutality and the rampant police state. And do not be disheartened or dissuaded by anybody that says that this should not be the way to go about it. Because this definitely should be. Because voting in its current state, us as citizens, our main way to go and interact with the political system as an entity is to vote, right? That's the most easiest, that's the most accessible, that's the way that's like we live in democracy. That's something that is afforded to every single citizen. However, in this situation, voting doesn't work. Not to say that voting is obsolete as a thing, but rather voting is not the end of this problem, and it will not come as a solution to this issue of police brutality without significant work to not only inform voters, but to change the system. By just voting as an individual, by voting without significant protest and activism, will not change the system, because look at the people that exist within the system itself. The people that the system wants you to vote for that should be the ones trying to change us. For example, the person running for a Democratic office right now, Joe Biden, who gained so much political cred by saying he supports the movement or the protest or whatever. He said he wants to give $300 million more to police departments. He's recommended that officers, instead of shooting criminals in the hearts, as he said, to shoot them in the leg. And like 60 to 65% of mayors across the country are Democrats. These are the people that you as a liberal would assume should be the ones trying to fix the problems. But they're not, because we vote for them. And we vote for them without having significant activism behind us and not having significant understanding of these issues to want to change them. Because these people represent us. So while voting, yes, is still important, this problem will not be solved with that. I mean, the protests have been going on for barely 2 weeks now, and have elicited more change to police as an institution than voting has in the past, 4 or 5 decades? The last big reform I know of was in the late 70s and early 80s, when the Civil Rights Commission toured police departments to enforce, early interventions with their own officers to stop brutality. But even that wasn't mandatory. We need these protests as something to force the Overton window of what is acceptable for our politicians to believe. Without the significant backing of activism and protest in the street against this significant police brutality, we will not have the option as citizens who can vote in our democracy to influence the ballot in such a way to stop police brutality. Yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a rant on voting. But in summary, keep up the good work, folks. It's all looking good. Well, not really, but you know.
Thank you so much for listening to Cheney's War Room. Stay safe out there. And remember to keep your eye on the ball and your pie on the prize. Fuck.
Well said, Nathan. Well said. My name is Porter Wheeler. You can find me on Twitter at Doc Bannington. Nathan, your other podcast with Faces. Do you have a new episode coming out soon?
Ooh, in a little bit, Porter. We're working pretty hard at it. I'll keep y'all updated. But you know, there is some stuff coming, some stuff in the works. Yeah. So when it comes out, you can find it on SoundCloud or YouTube.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, and goodbye.
Peace.